the meeting we missed last night, the GWA. For the record, those present at this portion of the meeting are myself, Commissioner Mtalco, Commissioner Sanchez, Commissioner Santos, and
Eric, can you speak in yours okay?
Here you know that the screen is wrong.
We're working off a wireless connection. Our wired LAN was what was giving us a problem, so it might be that way. The important thing is that you're not frozen, so as long as we can see you in the slides, we should be good. So I'm just gonna turn it over to Eric to go through the presentation, which summarizes the process that we're in and the results of the analytical studies, and then provides you with what our proposed plan is going to be moving forward.
and allows us to ask questions, right?
Yes.
Okay, good, go.
Yeah, there you go. John, can you close that settings box?
Yes.
Yes.
You might want to go to slideshow.
Yeah.
Looks good.
Good, looks good. We're good. It's nice and sunny.
Good day for solar.
What a year.
Yes, yes.
We have a brief presentation from Anthony, who is the architect of our rate application model that has incorporated all the analytical studies. It's also available to run scenarios or answer questions about the details of analytics, which we have been deeply engaged in for quite some time. So let me just walk you through what I thought we try to do is just try to take you from the original rate application and by way of providing some context and take one through to where I think we are and really point to what we are hoping that you will give us a sense of concurrence in terms of the overall financial plan to be submitted to the PUC on May 1st. We need a bit of time to take the financial plan once we've settled on it to then be able to determine specific recommendations for changes in rates and charges that will generate revenues to meet that financial plan. So we need a bit of time, and all of that, including the analytical models and so forth, all of that needs to be prepared and compiled for the May 1st submittal. So that's kind of where we're heading. And so by way of kind of starting at the beginning, let me walk you through a little bit about what we were looking at back in April of 2019, when there was the first discussions about looking at rate relief and what the original application for the 2020 through 2024 rate period, 5-year rate period was. So you'll see that back then we were looking at some somewhat more substantial rate increases in the first couple of years of the forecast period, 10s and 8.5s and 8s through 2022, and then tapering off a bit. A important thing to, I think, note in respect to this original rate relief request, sorry about the overhead noise, is the cumulative increase of 38%. Keep that number in mind as we proceed. So this was the initial rate relief request. You guys approved that some time ago. It was driven by the need to projects, the still in negotiation consent decree requirements and fund the various improvements and initiatives that are underway, perhaps most notably the water loss management and upgrades of the information technology. So that's where we were when we started this journey. The actual rate application was filed in July of 2019. I think it is noteworthy and frankly somewhat extraordinary that the PC order took effect in March of 2020. So that was a 9-month-long adjudication process. And unfortunately, when that occurred, there was no rate compression. So though the rate plan that was the basis for the PUC rate order contemplated full year implementation of the 2020 rate increase, effectively GWA received only half a year of rate relief in FY 2020, and then another 5% increase in 2021. Noted that a bit before the actual filing, the PUC engaged in 2019, the order of 200. And I would characterize them as some contentious settlement process. They identified a number of issues of concern: water loss reduction, demand forecasting, capital financing strategies, affordability, cost of service analysis. They asserted that the GWA's rate application was deficient and that it needed to be rehabilitated. That's, I think, the term that they like to use to provide for an orderly rate application. These concerns were the subject of, as I said, a number of protracted settlement conferences that led to a stipulation in January of 2021. That stipulation provided for the rate increase relief that I mentioned and the conduct of 7 analytical studies, as well as the development of an enhanced rate application model to replace the rate application model that they declared was deficient, though they were in fact the authors of said rate application. And then to basically provide, the stipulation also provided for this, as I'm showing to you, the granted and placeholder rate relief. So that the idea is we're going to give you the 5% rate increases again. The 5% 2020 rate increase was not was effective for only half of a year, and then there were placeholder values based on a set of assumptions about what was to transpire in the 5-year period. I think one of the things that's particularly noteworthy about this is all pre-pandemic. We're all happily going about our lives before the pandemic in January, February, and into March of 2020. So there are some other noteworthy things, though, about the stipulation-based forecast. One was that there was a projection of constant water demands and about a 0.5% customer growth. Again, this is all pre-pandemic. Other things that were really noteworthy is that there was a great deal of discussion about water loss reduction. Georgetown asserted that there was on the order of $13.6 million in O&M expense that might be secured from a more robust water loss reduction program. And again, that is for the FY 22 through 24 period. They also made some assertions about staffing and staff salaries and asserted that an additional $4.1 million in scheduled O&M budget could be reduced for the FY 22 through 24 period through salary savings. Other noteworthy components of the financial plan that was the foundation of the stipulation was that they suggested that the capital program would be financed through tax-exempt commercial paper. One thing to note is that per the study that we will mention, tax-exempt commercial paper would require legislative authorization to allow you to issue that. They also advanced the notion of using takeout bonds. This is basically refinancing the short-term commercial paper into long-term revenue bonds, but to do so with a capitalized interest structure that would defer debt service payments outside of the rate application period. One thing to know, we expressed a great deal of concern about that particular provision, which ultimately we ended up having to agree to. We have since confirmed that that type of an approach would run afoul of IRS regulations, and that you would not preserve your tax exempt status for the takeout bonds by using the capitalized interest structure. And so these were the rates that are in blue above are placeholder rates. They were always anticipated to be placeholder rates that would be adjusted through an enhanced true-up process that in the stipulation is termed a comprehensive review and update process. And that comprehensive review and update process was to be informed by the completion of 7 analytical studies, as well as the development of an enhanced rate application model. So let's talk a little bit about those analytical studies, but just by way of giving you a sense of the order of magnitude of difficulty that we are dealing with, is that all of this was happening, again, pre-pandemic. And if you look back at the stipulation, it shows that total operating revenues in the order of 121 million in 2020 and 126 million in 2021. I believe our projections for FY 2020, this current year, are right at $100 million. So we are working in a context with the stipulation pre-pandemic. Post-pandemic, you're talking about a fifth of the revenue base has been removed by virtue of the pandemic. Just a little bit about this rate application model, and the reason I want to spend just a bit of time on it. It is a quite enhanced modeling, and you'll see some stuff from Cody if we get a chance to work through it. It does provide for a consideration of each of these major components of basically financial forecasting, forecasts of demand and water production, cash flows, provides sources and uses of funds, and provides a mechanism to develop capital financing plans and a proof of revenue. Note that the rate application model that is still under construction, but we're getting close to being to having it completed, will provide all of the schedules that are called for in the PUC order, defining what are the minimum filing requirements for a rate application. So on May 1st, there will be a completed rate application in hand. You see, there's a lot of individual pieces of this modeling that we'll be working forward. And again, most of this has already been constructed. That rate application modeling has been constructed, and one of the things that is additional to the normal minimum filing requirements is that we are providing for a way of being able to show the implications of the 7 analytical studies that were required and were to be completed by March 31st, 2021. Just to give you an idea of who solutions, water loss reduction from your water systems optimizations, firm that includes Reinhardt, Sturm, and Stephen Preston. FT Solutions is doing cost service analysis. I worked on an affordability study as well as capital financing studies, and internal staff was used to conduct the capitalized labor and cesspool and septic tank elimination. Lily Magdalena, who has since retired, and Mo McDonald. I just wanted to take just a second or two to acknowledge the incredible work that was done by these folks. When we were at the PUC hearing where the stipulation was entered, at least a couple of the PUC commissioners, asked Miguel, "Are you going to be able to get all of this work done all by March 31st?" And you should know that all of those projects were completed, and I think are of high quality, and it is to the credit of these folks and your staff who provided extraordinary support for our work in getting this done and getting this done timely. As I mentioned, each of the analytical studies does impact the rate application model. This is sort of a graphical representation of how that happens. All these things sort of come together to inform what are the overall revenue requirements, how those requirements will be billed against billable volumes and billing determinants, how the capital financing will proceed, and then what does this mean in terms of overall rate revenue requirements, what does rate design need to look like, and how might that be informed by the cost of service analysis. So all that work is basically been completed and informs what we are presenting to you at this point. Just by way of giving you the absolute highlight reel of the analytical studies, sort of the takeaway messages for the analytical studies. The demand forecast noted that there has been a long-term trend of declining residential use per capita. Also notes that there is profound uncertainty about what is the bounce back effect, if you will, of the recovery from the pandemic. And this, I think, is noteworthy in that one of the things that we've done in terms of trying to develop a proposal going forward is ask ourselves the basic question: well, what if we were to take a somewhat more optimistic view of the prospect of recovery for purposes of developing a proposal to the commission? This is somewhat more optimistic than what it would typically be the case for a conservative approach to demand forecasting. So that's a key part. Obviously the demand forecast, what are the billable units that we're going to be able to bill and generate revenue from, is critically important to the overall revenue forecasting and overall picture. Another, again, takeaway from the analytical studies is that the water loss reduction targets that Georgetown had indicated we should be shooting for are indeed feasible. And I believe that Water Systems Optimization has put together a really compelling approach to determining how to go about evaluating water loss and identifying economic water loss reduction measures. One of the things for the purposes of, again, your decisions about the financial plan is that the estimates of net O&M savings associated with the water system optimization, water loss reduction, is roughly half of what was advanced in development of the stipulated financial plan. The stipulated financial plan called for, I think, around $13.6 million in O&M savings for the period FY22 through 24. Water Systems Optimizations is indicating that's about 7.6, I believe. So not as much near-term savings as was anticipated, and I think it's also important to note that there is $7 million of $7.9 million of expenditure involved in implementing the DMAs. Clearly, though, these will have a long-term benefit in terms of water loss reduction. The cost of service analysis work, I think, yields no particular surprises. I think we've all known for quite some time that there are inter-system and inter-class subsidies, that water is subsidizing wastewater and non-residential are subsidizing residential customers. So the cost of service analysis provides some affirmation of that, some quantification of those numbers, but also provides some important analyses to enable improvements in some of the more specialized charges, private fire lines, leachate, so forth. I think one of the more notable things about the approach going forward is the notion of more directly addressing water affordability. GWA is proposing an approach to a customer assistance program implementation that is reflective of, I think, some of the lessons that have been learned on mainland about problems with customer assistance programs in past. In fact, many communities have struggled to secure adequate participation in affordability programs that are done on an application basis. GWA staff had basically identified that there would be the potential of being able to administratively qualify individuals who are already income eligible qualified through their participation in programs like SNAP or TANF, and that may be a mechanism to be able to directly impact those customers who are most economically disadvantaged and provided assistance through other assistance programs, and in so doing also alleviate GWA of the requirement to have to screen income eligibility for large numbers of customers. In terms of the rate design component of the work, frankly, again, that will be required to be done once we nail down the financial plan. So we're hoping that we can get sort of the green light on the financial plan, and we will be coming back to you in a week with specifics about what the rate designs that we would suggest would look like, and what those rate designs will mean in terms of bill impacts for different customers at different usage levels. The alternative capital financing study benefited greatly from a fair amount of research that was done, and we actually issued requests for information to market participants. We got RFI responses back from a variety of investment banking firms, and had separate interviews of surety providers. So that informed much of the work there, and our assumptions about interest rates and so forth are informed by their estimates of what commercial paper, for example, might cost. Some of the specific recommendations from the alternative capital financing study, and which have, I think, again, direct impact for measures that you might take through your resolutions and so forth, is that it is important to go out and secure additional bonded indebtedness authorization. We're recommending around $200 million for that, a portion of which would be for putting in place commercial paper. Bond Council does indicate that such would require legislative approval for both these items. So that's something we think needs to move forward. Whereas in the stipulation, there was a call for basically attempting to free up the debt service reserve fund that was put in place through issuance of bonds, and use as surety. We have determined through our RFIs that doing so would be risky and potentially costly. So recommendations are to continue the current practice of using debt issuance proceeds to fund your debt service reserve fund, but improve the negative carry on those those proceeds through better investment practices. And again, there's if one does commercial paper or another form of short-term borrowing instrument, you are not able to issue long-term debt on with the capitalized infrastructure and retain your tax-exempt status. So takeout bonds, as they're referred to, are assumed to not include a capitalized interest component. Last couple of analytical studies, again, were performed ably by GWA staff, who acknowledged there are some improvements that could be made in GWA's approach to capitalizing, basically capturing expenditure amounts that are associated with capital projects through your J.D. Edwards upgrade and adopting some of the practices that are used by the Guam Power Authority. It increases the capitalization of labor by about $1.1 million, at least that's the estimate for, I believe it's next year. Not a huge impact. It doesn't really impact the cash flow requirements, but it does have a beneficial impact on debt service coverage. And debt service coverage is a driving factor in your rate decisions. And lastly, Mo McDonald and GWA staff did a really great job of looking at what are some of the opportunities that may come about in terms of being able to connect water customers who are also in areas that have sewer service, and prioritizing extensions of sewer service to areas that will protect source water. However, one thing to note with this is that in terms of the financial implications of the cesspool and septic tank elimination, which surely seems wise from a number of other perspectives, the cash flow impacts are anticipated to be negative. Not a ton, it's a relatively limited overall cost, but the costs involved in identifying customers that have access to sewer, to existing sewers, or more substantively to extend sewers is a proposition that will not yield net revenues, at least in the first in the rate application period. So that's the outcomes of the analytical studies. Again, it was a Herculean amount of work to get done. I think I know that you guys all have access to this. Some of it is not the most exciting reading in the world, but I do think that I would encourage you to at least sort of check out the executive summaries. I think that there's a lot of good work there. And again, thanks so much to GWA staff for their incredible support of this. We have been bothering them with questions and data requests for well on a year now. So the whole concept behind the stipulation, again, was we're going to give you 2 5% rate increases for FY20 and 21. Go off and do the analytical studies. Come back and use the analytical studies to make a determination as to what the rate increases should be for the FY22 through 24 period, which was characterized as a comprehensive review and update process. What I think there was general concurrence, at least at that time, again, this was pre-pandemic, that this would be a sort of enhanced true-up process. So that's, let's just go next to what that means. So this next set of rate increases is not what is being proposed. What this simply is it incorporates the analytical study findings into the financial plan that was put in place at that time, without alteration. And again, reflecting to some extent the impacts of the pandemic, but also reflecting the fact that there are many things that were assumed as savings levels or opportunities that, in fact, on further inspection with the analytical studies, do not yield the same kind of economic benefits that were assumed at the point of stipulation. So what you see here are some frankly biblically high rate increases that would be suggested by just incorporating the implications of the analytical studies unaltered. Cumulative rate increases of 59 and almost 60%, and a compounded in excess of 70% for the 5-year period of comparison. Again, this does reflect things like incorporating the projected decline in overall system-wide demand that was signaled by the extensive statistical analysis that was done for the demand forecasting work. Again, with a somewhat conservative eye towards that forecasting. It also recognizes that the O&M expense savings available was more along the lines of $8 million as opposed to the $13 or $14 million that was anticipated by in the stipulation process, and incorporating the capital program requirements for implementation of the DMAs. Sort of oddly, in the stipulation, there was no dollars that was put in place for actually funding the capital requirements for the district metering approach. Again, we've estimated affordability program requirements of around $5 million. The use of tax-exempt commercial paper, but in this case using takeout bonds without capitalized interest, so there's no deferral of those debt service increases that are associated with funding your short-term construction financing of your capital program. But the capital program is put in place as basically unaltered with the exception of the DMA implementation. And we also are continuing a 1.40 debt service coverage target. That, as much as anything else, is driving some of the rather substantial rate increases. And again, implementation of the conservative scenario for the cesspool and septic tank. So this rate increase program is, again, is what is recommended. It is, though, I think, an important benchmark for you to consider, because it basically says, here's what would be the case if you just use the analytical studies to inform the financial plan. The one thing that is that also I should notice is that there were no adjustments to the projected O&M expenses as a consequence of a staffing study that was to be completed by the PUC's consultants by March 31st, and which still is inconclusive at this time. So we're in a bit of an odd situation at this stage of the game. The stipulation basically said we'll do two years of 5% rate increases, go off, do the analytical studies. The analytical studies will inform us as to what should be the rate increases for the subsequent 3 years. Again, all pre-pandemic. Well, so where does that put us now? Because we are now maybe getting close post-pandemic, but we are in pandemic. So GWA staff, and we have a fair amount of time in the last month or so wrestling with the challenge of trying to be responsive to the implications of the pandemic, and thinking about how we might be able to structure a financial plan that would be, sort of push us about as far as we can go, while preserving the financial integrity of the system, but also recognizing that to the extent practicable, it would be helpful to try to dampen the rate increase requirements. Again, keep in mind the context here of about a 20% reduction in overall revenues in FY 2020. So the base that we're starting from is substantially lower than the base that was anticipated in the stipulation. So here are the proposed adjustments. The ones that are in red are a fundamental change from what we were anticipating. And the stuff that's in blue is basically trying to honor the intent of the analytical studies and the direction that those analytical studies suggested. So one that is, again, powerful is the notion of temporarily relaxing the 140 times debt service coverage target to 130. This would still put you above the indenture requirements, so you will not fall into technical default on the bonds. I think is understandable. I do a lot of work in the credit markets. You are certainly not the only utility that is going to be struggling with debt service coverage requirements in the immediate post-pandemic period. So I think this is, again, an appropriate balancing of the need to reduce overall rate increase requirements while still preserving the financial integrity. Likewise, we have worked with the demand forecasting folks to talk about how we might think about a alternative view of the demand forecast, recognizing that there is a long-term consumption trends that we need to be mindful of, but perhaps taking a bit more optimistic view of the pandemic recovery and usage trends than what is incorporated into the final report for the demand forecast for purposes of developing this proposal. I think one of the things to keep in mind here is that there is the recognition that we do have annual true-ups, and demand trends will certainly be something that we will need to watch carefully over the next 3 years. But for purposes of putting forward a proposal for the FY22 through 24 rate application, we have been working with A&N Technical Services to develop an alternative and incorporated that into our forecast. Perhaps most painfully is that the cost containment measures that were taken in response as an immediate response to the pandemic, much of that has continued for the FY22 through 24 time period, a 5.5% reduction from the baseline O&M forecast that we had previously put in place. Again, we are anticipating also continuing to try to honor the intent of the analytical studies, especially insofar as some of those provide for mechanisms to achieve savings. We would be looking at using tax-exempt commercial paper, just simply not using it, not doing a takeout bond in an awkward fashion. Doing the changes to the capitalized labor protocols, implementing the water loss reduction program, but with a more realistic assumptions about O&M expense reductions. Likewise for the cesspool and septic tank elimination initiative, and going forward with the affordability program. So that's what animates our proposed FY22 through 24 financial plan. Again, this is without Rescue Act funds being put in place. It is this financial plan that we would hope that you would basically give us a nod that says this is a reasonable direction for us to head for purposes of developing our May 1st, 2021 submittal, just what, 10 days away. One of the things that I think is particularly noteworthy about this is that if you look at the cumulative rate increases, it is just south of what was asked for back in 2019. So it's sort of remarkable that notwithstanding the impacts of the pandemic, we are basically asking for what we asked for initially. As a consequence, we believe that that also helps us or reinforces this notion that this comprehensive review and update process is really an enhanced true-up and is not a new rate application. We're not asking for anything more than we originally asked for. One of the things that is a detail to note is that the 7% 2024 rate increase might be lower if you were to use, if you do everything, coverage is a little bit higher in that year. But one of the things that we have been trying to do as we consider all of the rate adjustments is to avoid circumstances in which we would kick the can down the road, have a little bit lower rate increase in 2024, and then be faced with a large rate increase just outside of the rate application period. So the rate increase that's anticipated for 2025 is again at 7% in that case. One other thing to note is that we have in our financial planning assumed that the legislative surcharge percentage will be reset to provide for full funding of retiree expenses. These numbers, these percentages are a little higher than you may have been used to seeing. I think one of the things to recognize here is, remember, your revenue base is that much lower. And so if it's a percentage against that revenue base, that is how you're funding your retiree expenses, that percentage needs to increase to generate the necessary dollars. One of the other things just to note is that we have kept the lifeline rate increase constant across all the scenarios, just to try to make it easier for you to compare one scenario versus the next scenario versus the next scenario. When we get to rate design in a week, we will be entertaining adjustments to lifeline rates, lifeline thresholds, as well as general system rates. So again, what we're hoping for is that there's some level of concurrence that this is the financial plan that we can use for purposes of putting forward the May 1st submittal. Obviously, one of the things that is still out there, and we're not sure that we're going to get any further clarity on in time to incorporate in the May 1st submittal, is the potential availability of Rescue Act dollars. This decision is pending. There has been some discussions with, I believe, the governor's office and so forth. We've identified that if we were to be able to secure about $14.4 million, that those 10% increases could come down to 7.5% on the non-lifeline side. One of the things that, again, we're trying to not to do is say, oh, we can eliminate a rate increase in FY 2022 only to invite an enormous rate increases in FY 23 and 24 to fill that gap. So what we've tried to do is establish a ask, if you will, for the use of Rescue Act funding dollars so that we have a smooth rate increase pattern. So this is one of, I think, about 15 or 20 different scenarios that were run, but seems the most a practical and most straightforward mechanism for Rescue Act funding. As a general proposition, and again, we don't know where this will ultimately land. The notion is that we would apply any Rescue Act dollars on a across-the-board rate reduction basis. So it would impact everybody's rates by the same portion share. And I think this is the last of the scenarios. So this gets us again, from those 10s down to 7.5s. This assumes about 14 to $15 million in Rescue Act funding. For those who like accounting and finance stuff, we have been working with bond counsel and auditors to confirm that we can treat these Rescue Act dollars as a revenue replacement. This is important in terms of how the funds are booked and then treated for purposes of coverage, of debt service coverage calculations. As I mentioned, debt service coverage is probably your principal driver for rate increase requirements. So getting it recognized as a revenue replacement as opposed to a contribution is a big deal. And we have worked to try to make sure that can be done, and so that the Rescue Act dollars will be treated somewhat like the rate stabilization fund transfers for coverage purposes. So we're hopeful that Rescue Act funding will come in place, and I think we have a pretty straightforward plan for how to employ those dollars if, in fact, they come forward. So that's where we sit. Again, the whole concept around the Rescue Act dollars is to avoid later year rate increases by looking at a 3-year adjustment of the proposed rate total. And with that, that gets us to hopefully to a foundation for our May 1st submittal. Again, which we'll be bringing forward to you in a week will be, how does this financial plan translate to actual changes in the rates and charges that we would propose to be approved by the Public Utility Commission. So we'll be presenting to you rates, charges, and associated bill impacts and asking for an approving resolution at that time to make that happen. And that will get us through the second box, second arrow here on this adjudication schedule. So we've done all the analytical studies. We got them in on time. They're complete, along with a substantially enhanced rate application model. We have worked on how to incorporate the analytical studies into the financial plan, and obviously have had to look at substantial changes and adjustments from that which would have been implied by the analytical studies to come up with an updated financial plan. And then that gets us to May 1. And I will acknowledge that what happens from May 1 until the approval of the actual rates, the PUC hearings and a rate order is the subject of considerable and somewhat acrimonious discussion. There are questions and concerns about whether this is to be treated as an enhanced true-up, given that it's asking for no more rate relief than was originally asked for, or as a new rate application. What is the extent of the discovery process? What is the extent of the PUC's extent and process of the PUC's evidentiary review? At this stage, it seems the only thing that seems somewhat certain is that there will be a couple of rounds of RFIs that will be required, and that we will be providing analytical study and rate application model workshops to Georgetown in the month of May. And 2, I have talked enough. I will ask Miguel or Colin or someone to see if they've got anything further to add, and we are on standby to answer any questions.
Can you hear me okay?
I can.
So during the presentation on the slide where you go over the recommended adjustments and the items that you had in red, the demand forecasting number, the adjustment to that was at 4.8%, and I just wanted to clarify whether that 4.8% overall reduction as opposed to what was in the report, which I think was like a 10% overall reduction over the period, whether that also related to price elasticity and the range of price elasticity responses that the study implied.
Yes. Yes.
So does the 4.8 include like the lower range of that price elasticity response?
Right. So go ahead, Cody.
The 4.8, Miguel, is the baseline reduction. There would be some further smaller impacts beyond that to reflect the elasticity. We wanted to choose the two points, the 10% that you mentioned and the 4.8% are baseline impacts or impacts on the baseline demand forecast. Obviously, for the higher rate increase or the scenarios with higher rate schedules or rate increases, the impacts of the elasticity would be even greater than that.
Anybody else?
Commissioner Sanchez.
Thanks, Eric, great job. Very difficult stuff to analyze and appreciate the approach.
Thank you.
I was surprised, and I guess I've been paying as close attention as I should. I was surprised that the drop in demand at 10%, was that pre-COVID as well? And do you or Miguel have an idea of what's causing people to demand less water? We're not having fewer people, so just curious what's going on. They're fixing leaks? I don't know.
So this is actually been a pretty common situation throughout the U.S. Probably the two biggest driving factors, in particular on the residential side, are changes in basically water use. Water using devices. So both the plumbing codes and in response to really plumbing code changes is that, dishwashers bought today use a lot less water than dishwashers bought.
Did he free them? Hold on.
They're producing much less, a much more efficient water using feature. So what you've seen, and this is frankly true across the country, is fairly profound, in particular residential water use reductions, both from basically the water using fixtures as well as just conservation practices. In fact, I've got a good friend of mine heads the Michigan State University's Institute of Regulatory Studies, and she authored a paper called "How Low Can It Go?" That sort of talks and documents these national trends. There's also some AWWA research I'd be happy to point you to that talks about long-term trends towards declining, in particular residential consumption. The same is also to some extent true on the commercial side, where industries are adopting more water use efficient technologies. That's probably the biggest driver. But one of the things that Tom Chestnut can speak to much more with much greater clarity, I think, is that he looked at data over, I believe it was about a 20-year period, Guam specific data. So he captured billing data going way back, and there is a substantial and pronounced trend that is consistent over that 20-year period.
Commissioner Chaco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Eric, I have a question regarding, if we can go to slide 13.
Okay.
And I just want to understand, maybe the slide before, there you go. So just an explanation between the change in the delta from slide 13, which is the rate increases based on stipulation, and the proposed FY 2022 through 24 without the Rescue Act relief, going from a 31%, we'll start with the basic charge water a delta or a change from 31% to the proposed 10%. What were the largest impacts? Are they identified in the previous slide that showed those highlighted in red, that these factors were the largest contributing factors to that proposed reduction from 31 to 10%?
Yeah, so probably the best way of summarizing that really is taking a look at this, right? So what we did is we looked at it and said, well, what's driving these these huge amounts? So part of it are these factors here. And then again, one of the things that's important to note are these items that are in these bullets. So again, the stipulation didn't call for any demand reduction in its forecasting. Well, even at 4% per, 4.8%, that's a pretty substantial part. This is a 10% reduction. So that's a huge, you have a much lower base of billable units to bill against to generate the necessary revenues. Moreover, you don't get as much O&M cost reduction from the water loss program as what was anticipated in the stipulation. You've got a funded affordability program, and the tax-exempt commercial paper doesn't still provide some increases in debt service just outside the forecast period. So what's driving these extraordinary rate increase requirements is that so much of what was anticipated in the stipulation as providing this substantial benefit, on further inspection by actually doing the analytical studies, indicated that there was nowhere close to the sorts of cost savings that, frankly, were that's what they do. They came up with a much more, I would say, realistic and more robust estimate of the savings that would be achieved from still an aggressive and an appropriate water loss reduction program.
And just to clarify, the two biggest components are the ones you just referenced, as opposed to the temporary relaxation in the debt service?
Well, so the getting to the 31, 11 and a half and everything from the stipulation, these bullet points that are on page 13 are what's driving the substantial increase from, 5.5 and whatever. And again, overlay all of this with the fact that we're working in a pandemic, right? So what drove us from the 5.5, 2.5 and so forth that was in the stipulation here is we're working off of an overall base of billing determinants that's generating 20% less revenue than what we were seeing before. What takes you from these numbers to the numbers on page 15, on page 16, are these items here. So what is on 16 is basically GWA's response to this situation. So that's kind of the sequence, is that the stipulation was built on a set of optimistic assumptions, optimistic even before the pandemic. The pandemic hits, and it turns out that those optimistic assumptions were too optimistic. And so it produces this extraordinary rate increase requirements here on page 13. And so in response to that, GWA asked themselves, well, we want to certainly moderate these rate increase requirements when we go forward to the PUC next month. So what are our options for moderating those rate increases? That's where we looked at these items here and said, well, we know that the rate increases are being driven in a significant way by our requirements to achieve a 140 coverage rate. So if we relax that, we can get some relief. Likewise, we know that one of the things that's driving the rate increase requirements is that there's assumptions that the substantially lower base of water consumption that is resulted from the pandemic is assumed in the base case to be a more gradual recovery. So if we take a bit more optimistic view towards what the recovery might look like, can we put together a financial plan that is a bit more optimistic, keeping in mind that we have to keep our eye on that. And then again, the stipulation did not call for a continuation of the fairly substantial cost containment measures that Miguel and team put in place sort of immediately after the pandemic. And so continuing cost containment over the 3-year period was another response to the numbers that were on page 13 that show such dramatic rate increase requirements. So that's really how we get from what's on, what was from the stipulation, so what we're recommending as to be proposed.
Okay, thank you, Eric. So Miguel, for Tuesday,
I'm being attacked by a helicopter at the moment, but it should go overhead here quickly.
Throw some water at it.
what was that?
Attacked by a helicopter.
Okay. So Miguel, for Tuesday, what I'd like to see is for the GWA proposed adjustments on page 15, what I want to know is what are the order of magnitude, what are the impacts going from 31% down to 10%? What are the cost components of each of these? Meaning, for example, Eric had advised that the change in the overall demand, right, we're going with a conservative number, right? There's a dollar value associated with that impact that helped us go from 31% down to a 10% rate increase, right? I want to know for each of these line items, what is the dollar impact or the percent impact?
For each of the bullet points.
Each of the bullet points, yeah.
Got you.
And I'm assuming that they're in this order as they have the biggest impact. I may be wrong, but it seems as though the first bullet point is the temporary relaxation in the debt service. Did that one bullet point have the largest impact in the reduction from 31% to 10, or is it the drop in demand? Right. So I think it's demand. So in that order.
Okay.
We have some preliminary information on that. I was actually looking at that issue as Eric responded to your question, and it looks like, I mean, we can get you some specific data later, but it looks like the reduction in water demand and cost containment are about equal in terms of their impact on the financial plan and, of course, the subsequent rate increases. The relaxation of the debt service coverage target is not too far behind that, but it looks to be just a little bit less than those other two. And they're almost a 50-50 ratio, again, based on just some preliminary analysis I did within the last few minutes. So we'll follow up with some more specific answers.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, so
If
Commissioner
you let me
Santos.
babble on for a little bit more, you probably get your precise numbers. He's really quick.
Well, let's move on to some more questions.
Yeah, I just
Commissioner
have a
Santos.
question then. If you look at page 15, right, the adjustments are a combination and have to be all implemented, or are there ones that can be foregone for FY22, for example, and push down the line, if you want to use that term? Or is this something that we're going to approve and the PUC has to follow? I don't want to say that because they're their own governing body. So what is the plan here?
Well, a couple thoughts come to mind. One is that it will certainly be important that your annual true-up processes be deliberative and sort of examine where you are for each of these items. in particular water demand forecasting. There's a lot of science behind all that stuff, but at the end of the day, the pandemic is a sort of a black swan event. So it's really, really hard to know what's going to transpire with respect to that. I would characterize what we are putting here is that GWA has taken made a fairly aggressive effort towards trying to moderate the rate increase request for the FY22 through 24 period. If the PUC's consultants or the PUC were to basically start from here and continue to carve away, you will be carving away at bone. And I think you'd be talking about having to make some pretty profound changes in the overall financial plan. For example, I think that it would be hard, very hard, to sustain the same level of capital program requirements, capital program spending, and you would be having to look at you just don't have much place to go because coverage is really kind of driving that, and you've got these indenture requirements, and 130 is a pretty thin margin over technical default. So you'd be into more pronounced cost containment in a number of different ways, or you'd have to look at something that I personally loathe. But you might have to look at some kind of non-economic debt refinancing. In Chicago, we refer to this as scooping and tossing. And it's about as appealing as it sounds. It's an expensive way to basically restructure your debt.
And I think, Eric, maybe one other point to the commissioner's question with regard to the next 3 years, maybe comment on whether it makes sense to have a lower initial rate increase and then larger ones at the end, or what does that do to fiscal year 25? I mean, I think what we've proposed balances the need to make sure we keep debt service coverage, but also that we don't set ourselves up for, trying to put too much sugar on the pill now, and then in 25 we get hit with a much larger increase because we haven't built up the revenue.
Yeah, I think it's really important to keep in mind that rate increases compound. So if you avoid a rate increase in year one, you're that much further behind in year two. It's not as though you say, okay, I got a 5%, and so I wait a year, I can do 5%. No, you're going to have to do a 6 or 7%. If and so frankly, in order to be able to sort of be as solid as you can be, you're better off having higher rate increases earlier. I know that's sort of counterintuitive to what you'd like to do, but and so this is the reason why we have really tried to to hold to fairly consistent rate increases year over year, so that we don't get into a situation where you're kicking the can down the road and you end up in a difficult situation. And in fact, one of the things I think is worth noting is one of the reasons why you have a fairly substantial rate increase requirement now is because the capitalized interest structure of prior bond issues means you've got a big increase in your debt service requirements that are resulting from the 2020 bond issue being structured as a capitalized interest deal. We are strongly suggesting that you move away from that, because it leaves these untenable bombs a couple years out just when you've forgotten about them.
Commissioner Sanchez, go ahead. No, go ahead. I'll wait.
Go ahead, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. Eric, I wanted to say that my question is more along the lines, if we go along with page 16, which is a moderate, and I'd like to note that, from our original proposal, the lifeline increase was going to be an 8% in FY22, and we're now proposing an lifeline increase of 250 in 2024, which is a more moderate lifeline increase than we had actually presented in the original proposal. But if we went with what's on page 16, do we cover all of our needs for the next borrowing that we want to do? And how does this address the proposed consent decree that we're still coming down?
So the financial plan that would be supported by this rate increase schedule that's on page 16 does contemplate financing of the capital program as originally defined,
Okay,
plus the water loss DMAs,
okay,
without alteration. And in fact, at least in the 2022 through 2024 timeframe, you've got a fair amount of flexibility with respect to capital financing because, as is discussed at some length in the alternative capital financing study, by taking advantage of construction financing options, whether that's commercial paper or something called a put bond, you're on the short end of the yield curve for the financing of capital in the next few years, and interest rates are just really, really low.
yeah, so they stay there.
For short-term financing, and you have the ability to roll that those interest costs into your takeout bond. So we do need to be mindful about what is the extent of the indebtedness that would be put forward in 2025, but you have a certain amount of flexibility there so that we can structure the overall financial plan to preserve your commitments to the court order projects and the initial consent decree work.
Okay,
I will say that, as well as fund the water loss reduction program. I will say though that while you're meeting your commitments, the continuation of cost containment at the levels you're talking about is certainly uncomfortable. And again, this is why I kind of think that the posture should be this proposed rate increase plan, this proposed financial plan should be thought of as a significant and strong response to the issues presented by the pandemic. I think it's a credit to GWA to try to sort of thread the needle of keeping rate increases to trying to limit the rate increase requirements while at the same time trying to protect the financial and structural integrity of the system.
and I just have one more thing. Eric, you know, when it comes to like the water loss process and where we're trying to go with water loss, controlling water loss, I've always thought that you're not going to see a big impact to expense as you know, other people thought, you know, you could have this huge amount of savings. I never saw that. But I think the importance to me has always been, and I'd like to see whether you think I'm right, the importance to me has always been the fact that if we control the water loss and we get better, we get down to, I think our goal is like 20%, right? If we get down to the 20%, what we're doing though is taking less stress off our aquifer and preserving that as we go down the road for future, you know, for future use. That to me is a benefit that's not quantifiable. But do you think that's a valid point?
I do think it's a valid point. You know, I think that perspective is really useful. It takes things beyond simply the sort of specific financial mechanics.
Okay.
And recognizes the sort of importance of a more sustainable approach to your overall system and water management
Okay.
on island. One of the water loss reduction program is perhaps the most contentious thing that we have been discussing with with PUC's consultants. The PUC's consultants have effectively characterized GWA as being almost negligent in their approach to water loss management. And I think nothing could be farther from the truth.
I agree.
And what you see in the water loss reduction report, which I think is a fine report, is that GWA has adopted a very deliberate, a very informed approach to water loss management. And the critical things are that the kinds of reductions that even Georgetown Consulting Group have indicated should be the targets are in fact the targets that are being articulated by true experts in the field. But those targets are also informed by a better understanding about what are the financial implications of a deliberate, studied, disciplined approach to water loss management. And so I do think it has these sort of additional ancillary benefits that in some respects are even more important than the specific financial impacts. But for purposes of this rate application, one of the things that I think is important for CCU members to really understand is that the characterizations that have been made about GWA's water loss management performance are, in particular the PUC's consultants, are simply inaccurate.
Okay. Hey, Commissioner Sanchez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Eric, as I'm sure you're aware, and perhaps just to help our colleagues here to think about it, the court order from the consent decree from 2002, when this all started, which we're now at the 1 yard line finishing off the project, we had to borrow a lot of money. And as I looked at the numbers over these past 20 years, it seemed to approach somewhere between 60% to 2/3 of their rate increases was to service debt to pay for the consent decree. And, a huge chunk of the consent decree was building agate wastewater treatment plant, upgrading Agania, beginning the process of rebuilding the system. And so sometimes in explaining why the rates are needed, it was helpful to show our ratepayers. It said, look, I hate raising your rates, but 60%, 2/3 of your rate increase is so I can build a new house because the old one's fallen apart. And, again, it may not make Mrs. Cruz any happier that her rate's going up 7, 10, whatever the number becomes, right? But it is a recognition that the money is being put to a long-term need, whether it's protecting the aquifer, which you can't protect the aquifer unless you fix a new sewer treatment plant in agate and you start fixing things, right? So how much of the rate increase, so that my two questions, and I know between you, Miguel, you have these answers, if you can show it to us. How much, with the new consent decree, that's driving a lot of your capital needs for the next few years, correct? All right. So those capital needs need debt service and they need cash. So can you show us, if you don't already have it, how much of the projected rate increase during this period through 2025 is being used to service the debt that is needed to comply with Consent Decree 2, which includes a bunch of CapEx? Because, again, Mrs. Cruz may not like it, but if we're building Mrs. Cruz a new house and she's been living in a house falling apart for 30 or 40 years, she may not like it, but she'll appreciate that there's a positive use of her rates for a very clear benefit to her because her utility, her GWA house is being rebuilt. Should have been, woulda, coulda, shoulda is behind us. We now have to deal with our reality. But Consent 2 has a huge CapEx component, I'm assuming. That requires us to go out and borrow money. And that requires us to drive rates up to afford that money. Now, we're still going to tighten our belt at the 5.5%. Miguel's, as you said, I corrected correctly, Management's going to be challenged because we're going to have to tighten our belt by 5.5% a year in cost reductions. It appears that the sleeping giant that no one has talked about too much publicly is the fact that the denominator is going down, demand is going down. People are using less water per capita, per building. I run a laundry. I've reduced my water loss significantly, so I don't give Miguel too much money. So you're right, that's the reality of the world. And we're going to have to, the denominator is going down when you calculate the rate increase, that's why the rate increase goes up, right? So how much of the projected in the rates for between now and 25 is to service debt? And what projects does it fund, right? So that we can explain to ratepayers where's their money going when we raise their rate. That we're not just raising the rate because we feel like it and it's going to balloons and Christmas cakes. It's going to fix this, and that. Because it's sort of like when you see your doctor, you may not like what he tells you, but if he says this medicine will help you, you take your medicine, right? And this is sort of how we as ratepayers take our medicine to cure a long-standing problem of neglect. And just the fact that, Guam is 30, 40 years older than it was, and if we want to be here 30 or 40 years from now, we need to invest in the house, in a new house, to get that house prepared to handle the future Guam, right? So if you don't have it now, this would be very useful to me, is how much of the rate hike projected by page, the revised one, the one that's more acceptable.
Page 16.
16. How much of that is to service debt? And how much and what CapEx projects would be funded by this rate hike, right? If we can marry, I'd like to see those two so we can marry the cost impact to the outcome impact. That, yeah, your bill's going up, but it's going to help fix this, and that. And then it also helps us explain the percentage, it was, people understood because you drive down to Agate and you see a brand new plant, and when you say, hey, 60% of your rate increase for the last 20 years have been so we could build that plant, they can understand that, right? They can see it, right? So in analyzing this, because the chairman and I have been doing rates for 30 years, and I've been doing this stuff for 20 years at GWA, and it's as much an art as it's as a science, and your team has done a great job with the science part, and now we're making educated guesses about the future, right? And the fact that we get annual true-ups is good because, I'm still struggling a little bit, but I think you've answered it. The loss of the drop in demand is an issue. We need to get past COVID and get the hotels back up and get that going. And the fact that we look at rates every year gives us a chance to revisit, right? We make an educated guess in 2021 about 22, 23, 24, and 25, but we get to go look at that every year. So we're not married to whatever decision we make next Tuesday. We always have the capability, because of the way the process has been set up, to revisit it. But this is our latest guess. You're showing what it could have been. You're showing what it should be if we tighten our belt, if we lower our debt service coverage a little bit, and God bless debt service coverage. It's a double-edged sword for us. We're going to the market, so we need the best ratings as possible. So you want to keep that coverage up. Having said that, as long as you never miss a payment, they'll yell at you and they'll say, hey, now you're a C student instead of a B student, but thanks for the check, right? And the most important thing about these rates is to have enough cash to pay all the bills, including the mortgages. And that's what you've tried to assemble, I think, and done a great job of it. So if you can, so that's what I'm curious about, is how much of the rate hike is debt driven? What CapEx does it fund? And then maybe separately, Eric, I want to chat with you about some of the financing options, the short term versus the long term, because I appreciate, capitalized interest was the way we did it before, because frankly, that kicked the ball down the road enough so that we could get it affordable, because we had a big list from consent decree 1. And we're lucky we got the feds to pay for Northern. Imagine what the rates would be if we'd have to borrow $150 million for Northern, right? So we've done a lot of things, right? But debt, maybe just a short summary, does debt drive, between the drop in the demand and debt service, how much of this rate increase is because of those two factors?
So, while you have been explaining your question, my extraordinarily capable colleague
Great.
has been doing some calculations, so I think you may be able to report some preliminary answers at this stage. Cody?
Yeah, so obviously there's a number of factors involved, as you just explained, one of which is how much of your capital program is being financed with current revenues where you're not taking on debt, you're taking your net operating revenues and cash financing part of the improvements. Other things like SDC revenues and grants and other contributions. But based on the rate proposal as laid out in slide 16, we anticipate that GWA would finance about $150 million of their capital program with commercial paper notes. Now, the carrying cost, or the cost that counts against your coverage for the commercial paper program, is minimal. That's actually an understatement. It's almost a rounding error in the grand scheme of things because rates are so low right now.
Yep.
You do pay about $7 million or so for the program itself. That does not count against coverage. And the debt service on the takeout bonds, of course, when that debt service payment hits that you identified correctly in 2025, is just under $9 million for that program. If we compare the 8.8 million in terms of the incremental debt service payment for the capital program for these projects and improvements that need to be made as part of the consent decree program, if we compare that cost to the rate revenue base in fiscal year 2024, the percentage is about 6.3%. So just in terms of a ballpark figure, to answer your question, I would say
90%.
We're paying about 6.3 to 6.5% additional, or we need a rate increase of that order of magnitude to pay for the incremental debt service that will occur in fiscal year 2025 and beyond.
Okay, so
And keep in mind, you've got the numbers, because of the changes in the overall revenue picture, the numbers are really easy. Even somebody like me can figure this sort of math out. It's you got about a $40 million a year debt service obligation on existing debt service against a $100 million revenue stream at this stage. So about 40% of your existing overall revenues are going to pay for existing debt, and then Cody just walked you through what are the incremental increases that would be anticipated for the funding on a going forward basis.
can you do a slide 16A where Cody kind of summarizes what he says? So I really want to look at the cash flow required by new debt or paying existing debt that, we're past the CapEx side right now. Now it's time to hit the P&I. These percentages are good. I'm curious about showing the cash that flows from these percentages and how that cash gets allocated. Because my instinct and experience tells me that it's a substantial amount for debt, right? And how the debt was structured,
Right.
how the debt was structured before was how it was done, and there were reasons, good and bad, to do it that way. And frankly, Georgetown was the one to recommend capitalized interest debt financing 30 years ago when we first started, because when you were first starting, commercial paper and some of the other instruments were not as readily available at the time. But we're migrating, and for a lot of good reasons, right? But if you could prepare a summary of what the cash flow generated by these proposed rate adjustments, and how much goes to debt, maybe how much goes to ops, maybe, and then, well, obviously the rest goes to ops, but I also appreciate that two sacrifices are also being made. Miguel's got to run at 5% less costs than he has been, and our coverage is going to go down a little bit to keep it as affordable as we can get it. But that would be helpful to me if you could crank those numbers out and
Well, so Simon, Colin, can you throw the control over to Cody? If Cody's got a few more minutes, we may be able to just give you a little bit of or a preview of this incredible rate application model that he's built, because I think I think he may have that available right now.
I do.
But to your point, Commissioner, you're absolutely right. Debt and capital financing requirements are an incredibly important driver of your overall rate increase requirements. You at GWA have bluntly, you've become like my other clients who are consent decree clients who are deep into their consent decrees and where their debt obligations are the driving factor for their rate increase requirements. So, congratulations, you've graduated to a class that maybe you didn't want to have to join.
Yeah, and so have our ratepayers. So
Yeah, but I think Cody's got. I think this, and this is an incredible model here. But I think Cody's got some cash flow numbers that we can provide to you. And one of the things to note is, I believe in the submittal that we provided to for the March 31st submittal of the Analytical Studies, we also provided a printout of a lot of the schedules that are embedded in this modeling here. That'll give you a sense of what we have available that we can just sort of show you as part of that live model. What we provided on March 31st was essentially what we showed you for slide number 13. It doesn't work. Now we're showing you, here's how we're getting it to work.
that's the one we.
Cody?
Okay.
Yeah, and I just want to briefly touch on a point that's been mentioned by several of the commissioners: the comparison of the capitalized interest strategy relative to the commercial paper program. So one thing I've done, I've just put in a $150 million bond in 2022. This isn't part of the scenario, but just so the model will run the numbers. And you can see that 3 years of capitalized interest costs the ratepayers about $18 million under that type of strategy. When we zero that out and assuming that we're running with a $150 million commercial paper program, when we go to the cash flow statement, you'll see that the interest on that initial 3-year program, instead of 18 million, is just $200,000. So significant
that.
savings from an interest, and obviously capitalized interest won't hit your coverage calculations, but the $200,000 projected interest cost based on a $150 million line of credit for commercial paper is fairly negligible in the grand scheme of things. Where you do pay costs is what I'm showing here highlighted in row 41. The fees for that program, which I alluded to earlier, is just over $7 million for the 3-year program.
So you're going to save 11.
So that said, this is a summary of the sources and uses of cash in the operating fund. So you can see we bring in water, wastewater revenues, as well as the impact from any customers that are converted from septic tanks to the system, or customers that are just signed up to the system to generate our total rate revenues. We have a number of other revenues, smaller revenue line items that we forecast separately in the model. There's typically some post-billing adjustments that occur, collections and post-billing adjustments in this row. And then we have some other income that's in the past has been comprised mainly of interest revenues. And of course, because rates are so low, those are negligible as well throughout the forecast period. And finally, our last source of cash would be transfers from the rate stabilization fund to help with coverage. So we have the $11.4 million that was set aside fairly recently that can be transferred over to count against coverage, and then of course, once that's transferred, it becomes part of the operating fund balance and is used as GWA deems fit.
So this shows us this shows the aggregate impact of our cumulative debt and proposed new debt, and it's great. And I'll go look back at this table. It's in the stuff Eric sent us earlier. But again, I'm curious that if you take the cash flow of the next 5 years from the rate proposal on page 16, it's X, right? And then out of there is debt to finance at least 150 million worth of debt, new debt. And I can see existing debt's already at 31. I want to know what the incremental increase in debt, and I'll look at this spreadsheet. It looks like it's what, $8 million by 24, goes from 31 to 39.
Yeah, that's the 8.7 million that we discussed a little bit earlier in terms of that would be the debt service payment on the takeout bonds for the commercial paper program with an authorization of 150 million.
And so that 8.7 million is what percent of the incremental rate increase? That's what I want to look at. Not the aggregate, not the total, right? Just the increment. So like a 10% rate increase gives you $10 million bucks. Keep it simple, right? And if 8 million is
That's 80%.
8 of the 10, then continuing a consistent theme of how we've rebuilt this company is we're building a brand new house from a decrepit house. We're going to need to go and borrow the money so that we can keep it affordable and pay for it over time because the house is going to last long. And this 80, and I'm subject to correction. Correct me if I'm wrong, Miguel, Eric, and I'm sorry, Chris, I think. Cody. Oh, my grandson's name. I'll remember that now. 80% of the rate increase, that the incremental rate increase over the next 3 years would be is well, not 80%. That's 8 out of 1 year, right? Yes, right. That's 8 out of whatever your revenues are in 25, right?
Right.
Right. So, but the proposed rate increase on page 16 generates new cash. And 8 million of that is going to get consumed, from the new cash, 8 million is going to be consumed for what Cody showed us, right?
Right.
I want to see that. What is that
What is that
ratio?
in terms
What is that
of
ratio?
percentage?
Right? Because that's really what's happening to Mrs. Cruz. We're asking her to pay more for her water and sewer, right? But a chunk of that more is going to rebuild her house, our house. What is that percentage? Because, again, while people didn't like it before, when they recognized that 2/3 of the rate increase before was to rebuild a house that they all knew was falling apart, it was more tolerable, all right? And we still have a house that's not fully rebuilt, and we're now building the next part of it. And so I'd like to see that because I think my other takeaway from all of this is the hope that demand may change as the economy recovers, but I am concerned with what Eric pointed out earlier, and I think your research, Cody, that there's been a long-term trend of lower per capita demand because people are fixing their leaks, getting more efficient washers and dishwashers, toilets and stuff like that. So, yeah, it's sort of and there's, it's a double-edged sword for us. On the one hand, we want everyone to use less water because it protects the aquifer, less for us to produce. On the other hand, it forces the cost, the needed revenues to keep the operation going to be placed over a smaller denominator, which makes the rate increase. The other piece that I've learned through all these years is 37%, is a scary number. What I want to see is what is Mrs. Cruz bill going to be today and, 5 years from now. I know you guys know how to do all of that. And I'm sure or maybe you've already done it, it's on some slide.
It's there. I mean, Cody can show you.
What does Mrs. Cruz's bill look like in 2025 under slide 16 scenario? Maybe show us that.
Yeah, it's right there.
Right? So she's going to go from $93.
Great.
Oh, go ahead.
It's a great question. I want to make one point because I think it's a really good question because it emphasizes the difference between cash needed for operation of the system and revenues needed to meet your indentured coverage covenants in your bond documents. So in fiscal year 2020, when we're forecasting about 105 million. Based on the rate increase schedule we proposed, we reach 139 million by fiscal year 2024. So that's an increase of 34 million, which begs the question: if your incremental debt service payment is just under 9 million, why are we generating $34 million in incremental rate revenues? And the answer is it's related to coverage on your future debt service coverage requirements. So when we talk about rate schedules that are necessary, they're not so much necessary from a cash flow standpoint, but they are necessary given the impacts of the pandemic on revenues to get back to coverage levels that are part of your internal planning process, and also to prepare to avoid the rate shock that will come in 2025 when that debt service payment hits. So we build up additional cash, and that, of course, does not go to waste. That's one of the reasons why we can transfer some of the net operating revenues to offset capital requirements in the future, thus decreasing interest expense and some of the other carrying costs and issuance costs associated with debt. So there's that benefit as well. But it's something that we've discussed a lot with GWA. It's really your coverage calculation and the indenture requirements that are driving rate increases, not so much cash flow or cash management issues. You can see, in fact, that our days O&M, which was at 120 days as a minimum fund balance requirement, actually exceeds that over the forecast period because, again, we're setting rates to hit the 130 coverage. So we go anywhere south of 10, if we're at 7, have enough cash in the system, but we don't.
I mean, it's...
Could you reset and then go back over to the sources and uses? Commissioner, there's a couple points of that may help your narrative, and I'm happy to produce another slide to speak to this. But in addition to the new debt service that's shown on line 44, if you go just one line above, see that in 2023, there's a pretty substantial increase in debt. So as to your narrative that you were talking about Mrs. Cruz and the house, I think there's a couple of things that are worth noting is that the work that has already been funded
It's time to pay for it.
to improve the house,
It's time to pay for it.
right,
Yep.
is going to mean a $5.5 or $6 million increase in requirements by 23.
It's like a construction loan, and now it's time to pay the mortgage.
We also then have to prepare for the impact of
The next borrowing.
what is being built in the next few years
Yep.
that will hit our debt service obligations in FY 2025. So to Cody's point about, we don't want to, it's not purely a question of cash on hand. What we are trying to do is moderate the impacts of these two really substantial increases in debt service obligations that is all about, rebuilding the house.
No, you've done it.
You're absolutely right that it is the building of the house,
The new house.
coverage of that debt service obligations that is driving the need for that $33 million increase in revenues.
Yeah, and all I'm asking for your help, and you've got all the stuff. I'm confident that between you and Cody, you can help us get to a narrative. I mean, let's face it, well, I guess myself the longest, but the chair and many of my colleagues, we're elected representatives. We have to explain the narrative, and I've been doing it the longest. And and frankly, we were able to say, look, EPA says we better fix all this stuff, or else else is gonna come in and fix all this stuff, and you're gonna have rate increases anyway. So we can run our own system, let's make the hard decisions. That's what we've been doing for 20 years. And we've been raising rates, but we've been producing outcomes that people can see. So now we're going through another 5-year period where we still want to produce new outcomes, fix up the house, remodel it for the long term. It's going to cost us more. We're going to do some short term, I call it like a construction loan borrowing that's cheap. But when the takeout borrowing comes, it's P&I, and at some point you got to pay the P and the I. And that's life in borrowing, right? So, and I just want to get a real good understanding, and I can see it from here, that the page 16 rate increase over the next 2, 3, 4, right? 3 fiscal years, right? Right? Generates X in cash. This X in cash is going to be used these ways, and one of the biggest consumers of this X in cash, which is why we need the rate increase, is it's time to pay the new mortgage or the refinanced or the cumulative mortgage on a brand new house, because we all know the old house has to be replaced. And so if I'll review this, and if we can get to that percentage, is that what it is, 50% of the cash coming from this proposed page 16 rate increase?
That's just increase.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's going to go from 30. Oh, I'm sorry. Right. So I guess if you leave that line up, so what, 2 million, it jumps up to 8 million in 23, right? And so I guess if I added up all those incremental increases, 8, and 2, that's 18 million in additional debt service over the next through 25. Did I do that right? Something like that, right? It goes 2, 6, and then about 8 million, it looks like.
16.3 million
is the
increase in debt service.
I'm sorry, not in debt service, but in the cash needed to pay the additional costs. Okay, so 16 million, and then what's the total revenue we raise from the page 16 increase? So it ain't 2/3 like it used to be, but it's still half the rate increase is needed to help rebuild the new house and to comply with the new consent decree. And I think, one, we have to be transparent with our ratepayers. They need to know, hey, we've got a consent decree that has to be done. And then we also think other things have to be done. It's not just always EPA driven. And when we put that plan together, this is the borrowing plan. This is the rate plan to meet that borrowing plan. And 50% of your rate increase over the next 3 years is going to service the reconstruction of your new house. So that's the value you're going to get from this rate increase. And if we had a perfect system and didn't have to do any of this, then that rate increase would be cut in half, right? Because we would just be running operations, right? But we're going to be borrowing money for some time. Consent Decree 2 is going to need us to borrow how much over its life? 500 million, 300 million? Just quick, rough estimate.
Over 500.
Okay. So Consent Decree 2 needs another 500 million. We're going to try to do 125, 150 next year. But that's where we're going. And it's a consent decree. Either we do it or someone else is going to do it for us. But it's $500 million. And as we've talked about a lot, between 2003 and 2035, we're going to spend somewhere around 1.5 billion, 3 billion. Let's keep it simple, 1.5 billion. How do you raise $1.5 billion from this community? You spread it out over 35 years, all right? Well, we've gotten the first 20 years in the book almost. We've finished Consent Decree 1. We've borrowed 650 million, I think. That's why we need the new authorization, right? And when we asked for the new authorization, one of the things that was successful for us in the past with Speaker Ben was, Speaker Ben, here's the list from EPA. This is the number. Now, either you help us do it, legislature, or Francis Tidinko Gatewood will help us do it. And we'll force the rate adjustments. At least it's rate adjustments we control, and we can revisit every year, and we can talk about. But in order to justify the new borrowing, we need to create a narrative, as Eric alludes to, rightfully so, that explains to all the ratepayers, the legislature, who's going to, if the legislature doesn't give us permission, we can all go home, right? But who's going to explain that to EPA, right? So. Right, and we know, and we've seen that with the prison, and we've seen that with mental health, And we've seen that with trash, and all of them went into receivership, and that's not what we want to do. So,
I got a question on the.
Commissioner Santos, yeah.
Funds of 14 mil. Are we sure that the governor wants us to use it that way, or does she want,
She, in the preliminary discussion, she's been open to us using it in the manner that we proposed as revenue replacement.
doesn't want sewer lines and?
That's a separate discussion and a separate pot of funding.
Oh, okay. Agreed. Okay. Because it appears that you don't want special projects. I mean, that's the indication I'm getting is 15 people down in the legislature want a project done. Whatever, right? That's the talk I'm hearing. So that's in addition to probably the government asking for, I want sewer line done this way. I want.
that's why we have to show them EPA's list.
Well, the big difference is what the court orders versus
Exactly.
what you want and what 15 people.
Exactly.
To clarify, the projects that we've been asked about with respect to the relief funding are for COVID-impacted communities. That's what she's.
And like you said, it's a one-time impact, so it helps
Right,
you.
that's what we need to emphasize, right? That 14 million is never done. It's going to be spoken for.
And we'll throw it in there. But on a going forward basis.
That's why Miguel showed me it's spread out. Right?
Yeah. But once it ends, we still have to run this authority on behalf of the ratepayers in a financially prudent way.
Okay.
Anything else?
Anything else?
So
No.
maybe, Eric, if it's not too much, or Miguel, between the two of you, I think you've gotten a sense of the commission's interest in seeing, in creating a narrative that explains to our ratepayers, why we need this rate adjustment and how much of this rate adjustment is to service debt, right? Whether it's coverage, whatever it is. I just call it, people understand borrowing money to build a house or for a long-term need. Everyone understands that, okay? So if maybe there's a slide you can think about creating that breaks this down into kind of a source and use, but in a simplified summary basis that says, the proposed rate increases, this is what you're getting for it. You get this, and that, and how much of it, 50% of it, is for these projects that are in consent decree 2 that either we do or Francis is going to do for us, Francis Technical Gatewood. And why do we want the court to order us to do it when we know we got to do it? And so I think that will help us convince the legislature for the authorization. And obviously the PUC will look at it, and EPA is going to look at it, because EPA is going to say, how are you going to do this? Are you moving on it? Are you making any progress? And I mean, that's the movie we've been in for the last 20 years. We have a new movie, the sequel, Consent Decree 2, is it better than the first one? I think it's a little cheaper, but not much. And with all of your collective help, we're trying to figure out how to pay for Consent Decree 2, and this is what the ratepayers get from Consent Decree 2.
Right. Okay. We can do that.
Okay. Any further?
We'll be happy to do that. We're coming back to visit with you in a week. What we'd like to do is basically work under a hopefully a not too heroic assumption that you're reasonably comfortable with what we showed you for slide 16.
Mhm.
And then when we come back to you in a week with both the slides that we talked about that provide a narrative, talk about what's driving the reasons for the rate increase, as well as specific rate design options for you to consider for us to potentially put forward into our May 1st. Really, we need to kind of nail down what the financial plan is. What's the size of the pie that we need to make before we start figuring out how we're going to slice the pie up. So we really love to get an indication that you guys are reasonably comfortable with what we've laid out. We hear you. We need to provide you some narrative and some key messages. We need to be able to provide you information about what's this going to mean for the typical residential customer, what's this going to mean for a low-income residential customer, where we apply some of the affordability program concepts, so forth and so on, with other customer classes as well. We'll add that for you, but a starting point is your concurrence that that the proposed adjustments that we've laid out to come up with a moderated financial plan are sensible and are an appropriate path forward.
Okay. You know, I have some timing issue and thoughts on them. Our next meeting for the CCU is the 27th, Eric. It's the Tuesday night here on Guam. And I'm willing to maybe ask the commissioners if we wouldn't mind dealing with all the other issues on the night of the 27th. Maybe we could recess the meeting to the following morning so that you could be involved and online with us. If the commissioners are okay with that. Yeah, next Wednesday. You know, from the perspective of, we have all the others following up to this, because we have to adopt something that then our management team will take to the PUC. So I want to make sure everybody's good and everybody has their questions answered. And
I just asked
how's that?
the purpose of the follow-up meeting next week is tie up everything.
So between now and then, we have to finalize the rate package that we're going to submit to PUC. And so I think what Eric's asking is, we presented what we believe is a reasonable option, assuming no rate relief, no federal relief. And then we have, if we do get federal relief, we know how to work that in. But on the general concept of what we've presented as the proposal without federal relief, are you comfortable enough with that we can proceed over the next week to finalize on those general terms the package, and then provide a little more detail on slicing up the pie, meaning the rate design, I think is what he's asking.
Yeah, and I want to make sure the commissioners understand, we're talking about page 16, right?
Page 16.
Okay, so if we're all comfortable that we've got it enough, we're just going to let them now put it in final form. We can adopt this the evening of the 27th. If the commission would like to have one more talking go-around with the consultants, that's why I brought up this option of saying at the night of the 27th, we could always recess that meeting to the following morning so that we could have a final discussion with them. If not, only because on the night of the 27th, it's going to be late at night on their time. So do we want them involved or not? Commissioners?
Yeah, so Mr. Chair, my response would be that I see nothing preventing us from adopting it as presented
Okay,
because
no, I'm fine.
it's consistent. It's actually lower than what we initially adopted that was taken to the PUC the first time. So
Okay.
I
No,
believe
I-
that's from my perspective.
Okay, I'm fine with that, if everybody's fine with that. Go ahead, Commissioner Sanchez.
I mean, we got to do something. This is management's recommendation, is slide 16, correct?
Basically,
So,
yeah.
so
As
that's,
of this point, yes.
right,
and then
okay,
with
so
more
that,
detail on the
right, but that,
27.
this is your recommendation, this is what we ultimately say, yay, no, a little higher, a little lower, you know, whatever we say, right? So, I'm comfortable enough to allow management to document this more fully, and
Okay.
you can even eliminate the triple X and put in the numbers, right?
Right.
Okay,
And
that's
we'll
fine.
look at that. I do like the idea of reconvening Wednesday in case we need to talk to Eric, unless you're all kind of comfortable. Because, the other thing about this whole thing, we get to revisit this every year.
And the true.
The assumptions that we
Yeah.
thought today might change.
No, that's true. I just wanted to.
So nothing we adopt Tuesday is
It's locked in
you
cement.
can't, locked into concrete. I mean, we
Yeah.
can change it as the world
As the
reveals
world changes,
reveals
we'll
itself,
change.
right?
Okay.
So this is good enough, but I did have a question for Eric.
Sure,
Just,
go ahead, real quick.
Again, he can think about addressing it later if he can't do it quickly now. In terms of rate design, Eric, did any subsidies change, any rate structures change, or did you pretty much keep the structure of the rates and the subsidies? Did you keep those in place, or do you recommend changes? Because that's also going to be important to individual ratepayers. Did the commercial go up? Did the commercial go down? Did the residential go up? Did the residential go down? Can you talk a little bit about rate design?
We're going to provide you a set of ideas at the upcoming meeting. I'm going to leave you a little bit of previewing here. So we've incorporated an affordability program that does provide relief to low-income customers during that may provide us some mechanism to adjust some other aspects of the residential rate design. So for example, we will look at what happens if we were to reduce the the lifeline threshold from 5,000 to let's say 3,000. What that might mean in terms of revenue generation and impacts on customers' different usage levels. We will look at, for example, what if we were to charge for wastewater service on the basis of billed wastewater volumes. 80% of water use, and what are the revenue generation, bill impact option, or impacts and alternatives associated with that. I don't think that there will be significant changes in the form of rate design for non-residential customers, sort of standard base charge and uniform volume charge. But there are possible changes in the rate levels that might address some of the variances from cost of service. And potentially changes in the levels of subsidy across different customer classes. One of the things that you're proving, if you will, not necessarily formally, but you're giving us an indication that our slide 16 is you're comfortable with is that we will give that to our cost of service analysis consultants, who will then be able to use those numbers help us define what are the cost of service-based rates, which will serve as a benchmark for how we think about rate design. But what we're coming back to on the 27th with is, okay, now that you've told us that you're okay with the basic financial plan, how do we suggest that we go about generating the revenues that financial plan calls for? And that may mean changes in the rate design for residential water, residential wastewater, and non-residential customers. So that's, I think, the bulk of the discussion that we will have 27.
Okay, so implicit in slide 16 is some thought into it. You haven't revealed all the basis for it, which is what you want to do next week. Because, yeah, it's important to know that this is a macro estimation of gross revenues. It doesn't tell you who's paying those gross revenues and whether the way they were paying it before in terms of cost allocation has changed. Are you saying slide 16 has some cost allocations based on the updated cost of service between rate classes?
It's just got sort of the preservation of the status quo. So we do not have the revised cost of service analysis numbers nor proposed rate designs. What we're giving you now is we want you to basically feel comfortable that we have sized the pie correctly. Once you tell us, yeah, you're comfortable with the size of the pie correctly, we can then go about the process of figuring out who should get what slices of what of the pie.
Or who should pay for it?
Okay, so I'm fine with that. We'll go to Tuesday night, and
Yeah, I just want to make sure that, we have to disclose if we change rate structure, we got to just, one, you want to disclose that to us so we understand it, and then obviously you have to disclose it to the PUC and the public, and they'll take a look at it.
The PUC is expecting it because they asked us to do this.
Right. But am I understanding, Eric, correctly that at least for FY22, there's not a lot of change in rate design and structure?
No,
there will be.
The projections.
Or there is?
Very well could have some significant
Changes,
in rate
yes.
design.
Okay.
To be specific, I'll give you a specific example.
Okay.
So one of the things that this stipulation really signaled was this notion that your existing residential rate design is
Fair. Yeah.
provides a substantial subsidy to all residential customers. We're treating everybody as though every residential customer as though there's a need to provide a subsidy to them. The concept, I think, that is you see happening in terms of the stipulation and in terms of what you're seeing around the country is we really ought to be most concerned of those those residential customers who are struggling economically. So I
Be a lot of
think we
customers.
will at least provide you some actions that says, let's look at actually increases to the cost, to the revenues recovered from general residential customers, but identifying a group of economically disadvantaged customers that we want to provide assistance to. So a more targeted approach to addressing water affordability than the sort of blunt instrument that has been used historically through the lifeline rate that is applicable to all residential customers.
But Eric,
As an example of the policy questions that we're going to present to you next week.
So, but Eric, and I know you've looked at it more closely than I have in a while, but I know the original blunt instrument when Chairman Duenas and I were on the PUC was the recognition that that we get 1.5 million tourists, and everything we can do to export some of our burden to them, to pay down the residential side, was perceived at the time, and even I think today, that I'd love to have those tourists help pay for keep a residential rate down, right? And so I think that's the more blunt instrument that has been in effect for 30 years. And I'm just curious whether does this commission want to continue to use that type of instrument that says when you do cost of service, hotels should pay X and Mrs. Cruz should pay Y. But because hotels get revenue streams from 1.5 million tourists, let's bump the hotel rate up a little bit higher than cost of service and use that additional money and buy down Mrs. Cruz's rate. You know, that's what Eric's alluding to, is that's the other blunt instrument that's been around forever. And I'm just curious, Eric, from looking at what we're doing now, is that blunt instrument tool still available as from a rate design point of view to this commission and the PUC to think about and utilize? How do we want to purposely charge tourism more than Mrs. Cruz, higher than its cost of service than Mrs. Cruz? How do you think about that?
Well, so I guess, again, we'll present specifics about this, but yes, that situation where essentially non-resident, particularly houses and so forth, are subsidized residential customers, it is not going away anytime soon.
Good, okay.
The issue I think that you are challenged by is that the nature of the existing legislation means that that gap continues to widen. Subsidy continues to get bigger and bigger and bigger, absent change in the rate design. So we're going to basically present to you some ways in which you can think about how you might want to change that approach that doesn't continue to widen the gap, that maybe focuses the assistance more specifically on Mrs. Cruz, the economically disadvantaged customer, as opposed to Mrs. Cruz that's living in a nice
Barragata Heights.
So what I think that the issue is that there's no way that you're going to be in a situation where you're going to have, I think, residential customers paying both the cost of service for residential customers. There will be subsidies of residential customers by non-residential customers embedded in your rate making. I would project for a decade or more.
Okay, answered my question. Thank you, that's perfect.
What we're going to provide to you are some options whereby the levels of subsidies may be attenuated, and that the nature of the subsidies may be more targeted towards those customers that are really in need of subsidy, as just assuming that every residential customer warrants subsidy.
Fair enough.
That's what will be coming to you.
So it seems like, Eric, we should just plan on a Wednesday morning.
Well, why don't we do this? Why don't if you could get us the data before the meeting, like the morning of the 27th, so that those of us could go through it and Commissioner Sanchez can look at it, we can all have a chance to look at it. Let's see how we do Tuesday night. And if we're all fine with the package, we're done, fine. If we're not quite clear on everything, what I'm trying to say is we can always recess the meeting to
I
Wednesday
know,
morning.
I understand, I just want the team to placehold that possibility in their schedules.
Okay.
I mean,
I would say placehold it on your schedule. We might not do it, but you know.
Oh, the evening meeting?
No, the Wednesday morning.
Wednesday
Oh,
morning.
yeah.
It's just to give them an opportunity to schedule their time.
That sounds good. And it gives us time, we may still have more questions Tuesday night, right? And
Yeah,
gotta-
we may,
This
we
is
may.
important, this is an important decision for
Yeah.
us. It really kicks off what happened
new
20 years
level.
ago. New consent decree, new requirements. keep
And then
rebuilding the
also
house.
an update on
Yeah.
water loss and a whole
Yeah,
bunch
yeah,
of
with
stuff.
a lot more detail.
A lot more
And
detail
it was still
going
a-
into the pie.
Yeah, and more to
Okay.
come, more to come. still.
Okay, so that's fine. Okay, motion to adjourn the working session?
Anything else?
Motion to adjourn? So, Commissioner Sanchez, second, Commissioner Martinez. Meeting's adjourned. All those in favor, aye.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Eric.